She thought she was just watching a quiet suburban kid for the evening. But when she reached under his bed to grab a dropped toy, her fingers brushed against something cold, metallic, and wrapped in a stained cloth. The night began normally enough. She arrived 15 minutes early, just like she always did. The parents were dressed for an evening out, their voices cheerful but rushed. They gave her a quick tour of the kitchen, pointed out where the snacks were, left the emergency numbers by the phone. Nothing out of the ordinary, except for the boy. He stood in the hallway, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit, his wide eyes fixed on her as though trying to decide if she was safe to trust. When his mother urged him to say hello, he whispered something she couldn't quite catch, then disappeared into the living room without another word. Once the parents left, the house seemed to exhale, but not in a comforting way. The silence that followed wasn't the peaceful kind. It was dense, layered, like a blanket weighed down with stones. She could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. But there was something else. Every so often, she thought she caught the sound of a faint, deliberate tap. Not constant, just enough to make her ears strain for the next one. The boy was curled up on the couch, flipping through a picture book. She tried making conversation, asking about his favorite shows, his school, his friends, but his answers were short, clipped, and often didn't come at all. He kept glancing toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms, then quickly back to his book as though he didn't want her to notice. At first, she chalked it up to shyness. But then he said something that lodged itself in her mind. "Don't go in my room unless the lights are on." She laughed softly, thinking it was just a child's quirky preference. But when she asked why, he didn't look up. "Things don't like the dark," he murmured. His tone was matter-of-fact, not playful. Before she could ask more, the tap-tap-tap came again, this time slightly louder. She looked down the hallway, but it was empty. A half-hour later, she decided it was time for him to brush his teeth and get ready for bed. That's when the real resistance began. The boy's face tightened. His grip on the stuffed rabbit turned white-knuckled. "Can't I sleep on the couch tonight?" he asked, his voice just above a whisper. She reminded him that his parents wanted him in his own bed. But he shook his head so violently that the rabbit slipped from his grasp and fell to the floor. "Please," he insisted. "It's safer here." She crouched to meet his eyes, trying to reassure him. "Safer from what?" she asked, her voice gentle. His gaze flickered to the hallway again. "The basement door is locked for a reason," he said, and in that moment, she realized she had never been shown the basement during the house tour. Something in her gut told her not to press too hard. Instead, she led him toward his bedroom, flicking on the hallway light before they stepped inside. The boy stayed close behind her, his small footsteps quick and nervous. When they reached the room, she noticed it was unusually tidy for a child his age. The bed was made perfectly, not a wrinkle in the blanket. The shelves were neatly arranged with books and toys, but there was an emptiness to the space, as though it was staged rather than lived in. While he brushed his teeth in the adjoining bathroom, she sat on the edge of the bed, trying to shake off the unease. That's when she heard it, this time coming from directly beneath her feet. A faint but distinct scrape, like something being dragged slowly across the floorboards under the bed. She froze, every muscle tight, her mind racing to find a rational explanation. Mice. A settling house. She bent down slightly, peering into the shadowed space. But the darkness under there seemed almost unnatural, swallowing the thin beam of light from the bedside lamp. The boy came back into the room, saw her leaning over, and instantly went pale. "Don't," he said sharply. His voice carried a note of fear that no child should be able to muster so convincingly. She straightened up, masking her own nervousness. "What's under your bed?" she asked lightly. He didn't answer. Instead, he climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to his chin, eyes fixed on the ceiling. The silence stretched. Then, so quietly she almost didn't hear it, he said, "It doesn't like to be touched." She told herself it was just a child's imagination, the product of too many bedtime stories or scary movies. But the scraping sound came again, sharper this time, followed by a faint metallic click. She found herself glancing at the door to the hallway, the thought creeping in that maybe she should check that locked basement, just to put her mind at ease. The boy must have sensed her thoughts because he spoke again, his voice low and urgent. "If you open the door, it'll know." The room felt colder than before, the air thicker. She forced a smile, told him to get some rest, and stepped out into the hallway. But as she walked away, She couldn't shake the feeling that the boy's strange behavior wasn't just shyness or bedtime stalling. Something was wrong in that house. Something he knew, but wouldn't, or couldn't, explain. And the sound under the bed hadn't stopped. The scraping sound lingered in her thoughts long after she left the boy's bedroom. She tried distracting herself in the living room, scrolling through her phone, sipping the tea she'd made earlier, but her ears stayed tuned for any unusual noise. The house was too still, like it was waiting for her to make a move. Every creak in the floorboards, every faint hum of the refrigerator seemed amplified. Then it came again. This time, the sound was sharper, almost deliberate. Not random, not an accident. She set her cup down, her fingers trembling just enough to clink against the ceramic. She told herself she was being ridiculous. Plenty of houses made strange noises at night. But her chest felt tight, and she realized she'd been holding her breath. The thought of the boy's warning replayed in her mind. It doesn't like to be touched. The words didn't sound like a game anymore. Eventually, she couldn't take it. She stood, moving down the hallway with slow, cautious steps. The lights hummed faintly above, casting yellow pools on the floor. She stopped outside the boy's door, listening. Silence. She pushed the door open quietly. The boy was asleep, or at least pretending to be. His breathing was steady, his small frame curled on one side. But something about the air felt heavier in here, colder. She glanced at the bed, and her stomach tightened. The blanket's edge hovered just above the floor, revealing the faintest sliver of shadow underneath. She knelt down, her heart pounding so loud she was sure it would wake him. Slowly, she lowered herself until her head was level with the gap beneath the bed. At first, she saw nothing, just darkness. But the darkness was wrong. It wasn't the kind that came from an absence of light. It felt dense, almost textured, like the air under there was thicker than the rest of the room. Her hand hesitated halfway to the floor. She told herself she'd just check for a fallen toy, maybe a misplaced shoe, and then she could laugh at herself for being paranoid. But when her fingers slipped into that shadow, they brushed against something cold. Not just cold, icy. She pulled back instinctively, her pulse spiking. But curiosity, that stubborn human flaw, made her reach again. This time, her fingers found the smooth edge of metal, and then a soft, stiff fabric around it. She gripped the object and began to pull. The resistance was immediate. It felt as though something was holding on to it, a faint tug from the other side. Her breath caught, but she pulled harder, her knees pressing into the carpet. The object slid forward with a scraping sound that sent goosebumps racing up her arms. Finally, it came free. She sat back, holding it in her lap. The cloth was old, frayed, and stained, dark splotches that had seeped deep into the fabric. Her first thought was rust. Her second thought was worse. She unwound the fabric slowly, each layer sticking slightly before peeling away. Beneath it was a small, heavy metal box. The surface was dented and scratched, the lock tarnished with age. Her fingers lingered on it, the metal biting into her skin with its unnatural chill. She had no idea why, but every instinct told her this box wasn't meant to be opened. Not here. Not now. She looked over at the boy. His eyes were open, wide, staring right at her. "Put it back," he whispered. His voice was hoarse, like he'd been holding in the words for too long. She froze, caught between questions and fear. "What's in it?" she asked. The boy's lower lip trembled, but he didn't answer. His gaze flicked to the door, as if expecting someone, or something, to appear. Then he said, even softer, "If it knows you touched it, it won't stop." Before she could respond, a faint knock echoed from somewhere inside the walls. 3 slow, deliberate taps. She jerked her head toward the sound, her skin prickling. The boy sat up in bed, clutching his stuffed rabbit so tightly its fabric strained at the seams. She wanted to leave the room, to set the box down and walk away, but the weight in her hands felt like it had rooted her to the floor. She forced herself to move, slipping the box back under the bed. Her hand had barely left the shadow when another noise came, a metallic click, like a lock turning. The boy flinched, burying his face in the rabbit. "You shouldn't have touched it," he mumbled, the words muffled but clear enough to twist her stomach into knots. She stood up, backing toward the door. Every nerve in her body screamed to get out of the room. She flicked off the light and stepped into the hallway, but as she turned, she thought she saw movement in the gap under the bed, a faint shifting, like something had slid back into place. Her palms were slick with sweat, her heart hammering. Whatever that box was, it wasn't just an old forgotten toy. And if the boy's reaction was any indication, it wasn't something safe to keep in a child's room. But the most disturbing thought was the one she couldn't shake as she closed the bedroom door behind her. The box hadn't been in the middle of the floor. It had been near the very back, almost touching the wall. And she had this sickening feeling that there was space behind that wall. Space big enough for someone, or something, to hide. She spent the rest of the evening on edge, every creak of the house making her glance toward the hallway. The boy hadn't called out again, but she could feel his fear lingering like a shadow in the air. She considered calling the parents, but what would she say? That there was a strange box under the bed that made her feel wrong? They'd think she was imagining things, or worse, that she was prying where she shouldn't. Hours dragged by, slow and heavy. She tried to focus on the television, but the sound felt hollow, as if the house was swallowing the noise. From time to time, she caught herself glancing at the clock, willing the minutes to pass faster. When the headlights finally swept across the front windows, she exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The parents walked in moments later, their laughter from the driveway fading the moment they stepped inside. Something in their expressions shifted when they saw her, an almost imperceptible tightening around the eyes. "Everything go all right?" the father asked. His tone was casual, but the way his gaze lingered on her made her uneasy. "Yes," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "He's asleep. Quiet night." The mother set her purse on the counter but didn't take off her coat. "You stayed in the living room the whole time?" she asked, too casually. Her heart skipped. "Mostly." "What?" "No reason," the mother replied, but her eyes flicked toward the hallway. "We just don't like people wandering around the house too much." That was odd enough to make her skin prickle, but before she could respond, the father excused himself and disappeared down the hallway. She could hear the faint sound of his footsteps on the carpet, followed by the soft creak of the boy's bedroom door opening. The mother busied herself with her phone, not meeting her gaze. She could feel the silence stretching between them like a taut wire. Then, faintly, came the sound of something being moved, a scrape on wood, then the rustle of fabric. She swallowed. "I did have to go into his room," she said finally, her voice low. "He was getting ready for bed, and—" She trailed off, unsure how much to admit. The mother's head lifted, her eyes sharp. "And there was a box under the bed." The words left her mouth before she could decide if telling the truth was a mistake. The mother didn't move, but something in her face hardened. "You touched it." It wasn't a question. She felt the air in the room change, heavier somehow. "It was wrapped in cloth. I didn't open it. The father reappeared in the hallway, holding the metal box in his hands. The cloth was back around it, tighter this time, knotted at the top. His jaw was set, and his eyes didn't blink as he looked at her. "You need to go," he said quietly. Confusion and fear knotted in her chest. "Why? What is that thing?" Neither of them answered. The mother stepped toward the door, as if to guide her out. "It's not your concern," she said softly, almost apologetically. "The less you know, the better." Something in her bristled. "Your son is terrified of whatever's in that box," he said. The father's voice cut through hers like a blade. "Our son says a lot of things he shouldn't. We do what's necessary to keep him safe." Safe. The word rang in her ears, but it didn't feel like safety was what they were protecting him from. It felt like containment. She hesitated, her gaze locked on the box in the father's hands. For a brief moment, she thought she saw it shift, not a trick of the light, but an actual movement beneath the cloth, as if something inside had turned over. The mother opened the front door. Cold night air spilled into the room. "Please," she said, "go home. Forget about tonight." Her mind screamed with questions, but the father's grip on the box and the quiet urgency in the mother's voice told her there was no chance they'd give her answers. She stepped outside, the chill biting through her jacket. As the door closed, she caught one last glimpse of the boy standing at the end of the hallway, his face pale and unreadable. She walked down the driveway, the sound of the door locking behind her echoing in her ears. But as she reached her car, a sound drifted out through the thin walls of the house. A faint, deliberate knock. 3 slow taps. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with her keys, but she couldn't help looking back at the house. The windows were dark now, but in one of them, the boy's bedroom, she thought she saw a flicker of movement, a shadow shifting just out of view. She started the car and drove away. The image of that metal box burned into her mind. She knew she'd never set foot in that house again. But deep down, she also knew the truth. Whatever was in that box hadn't been still when she left, and she had the horrible feeling it wouldn't be still for long.